Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. Long before the crowds lined up to step into the vast embrace of St. Peter's Basilica, before the gilded altars and saints in marble, even before Christianity had become a whisper in the Roman wind, there was a hill, a quiet, sun-struck slope on the west side of the Tiber. It was steep in parts, drowsy in others. Locals called it Mons Vatican's Vatican. Kel. You may imagine it was empty once, unclaimed, just a patch of grass or a scrubland waiting to be built upon. But that's rarely how land works in history. Nothing is truly empty. Not in Rome, not in the bones of an empire. Vatican Hill was never really part of the heart of ancient Rome. It sat just across the river from the bustling city. It's close enough to see the red roofs of the Palatine and Capitoline hills, but far enough to be different. It was unprotected by Rome's early city walls. This alone gave it a sort of sacred isolation. The living didn't cluster here, but the dead, they did. You see, in the Rome of the Republic and early empire, the dead had to stay outside the city. Roman law forbade burials within the sacred city boundary, the Pomerium. Death, to the Romans, was religiously polluting. So they sent their dead out to the edges, the margins. And Vatican Hill was one of those edges. And so the hill became an Acropolisa, city of the dead. Not a grand one, not a state cemetery. It's just a gentle, accumulating slope where the ordinary Roman dead were laid to rest. Their names etched in Latin on modest stones, their bones wrapped in cloth, sometimes protected by tiles, sometimes not. These were people who died with little fanfare, but who were buried with care. Fathers, mothers, merchants, children, a shoemaker, a cook, a freedwoman who had worked her way out of servitude. They lie in silence beneath what would one day become the holiest structure in Catholicism. But at the time, their tombs were unassuming. If you had walked along the Via Cornelia, the road that led west out of Rome, you might have passed these tombs without much thought. They were carved into the slope or raised just above its simple brick enclosures. O Columbaria, holding the ashes of cremated loved ones. Occasionally, there were marble sarcophagi for wealthier families, painted frescoes, terracotta urns, small offerings to the spirits of the dead the mains left. In front of doorways, the air would have smelled of dust and resin. Cypress trees might have swayed gently, their roots entwined with bone. A quiet hill, a hill of memory, and yet memory is a strange thing. It slips through cracks, gets overwritten, layered. The transformation of this place into the seat of Christendom didn't begin with glory. It began with a man perhaps no one would have noticed him at all. A man named Simon, from Galilee. We know him better as Peter, according to tradition. Peter was executed during the reign of Emperor Nero, around 64 AD. The manner of his death crucifixion was reserved for the lowest, and the location of his burial, likely here, on this very hill. Lie in the soil of this quiet pagan necropolis. Christian tradition holds that Peter was buried in a shallow grave, perhaps with a simple marker. He had no monument, no great tomb, no basilica, just dust and bone, lost among the many other forgotten dead. And yet, even in that obscurity, something strange happened. A memory lingered. The followers of Peter, the early Christians of Rome, whispered about the place. They came quietly, they prayed, they remembered, while the pagans still buried their own. Christians gathered discreetly nearby, and over time, that memory uncertain, hazy, grew stronger. But still, for nearly 3 centuries, this hill remained. In necropolis, pagan families continued to bury their dead here well into the 3rd century. Some practiced the old rites, burning incense, pouring wine libations, invoking Mercury or Juno or Bacchus. Others, perhaps uncertain in their beliefs or blending traditions, marked their tombs with ambiguous symbols: a fish, an anchor, a palm branch. By now, Christianity was growing, slowly, painfully, underground. It had no churches. It met in homes, in catacombs, and yet it remembered this hill. It remembered Peter. And then came Constantine, Emperor Constantine, the great ruler of the Roman world. The man who would make Christianity legal stood at a turning point in history in the early 4th century, after his vision of a cross before battle and his triumph at the Milvian Bridge. He embraced the Christian God, and he sought to mark this new era with monuments, churches, sacred spaces. One of his first targets, Vatican Hill. But building a church here was not easy. There was no flat land, no clear space, no foundation, just a dense slope filled with centuries of tombs. And yet, Constantine ordered the construction of a grand Basilica church to honor St. Peter. To do so, his builders had to cut deep into the hill. They had to flatten the slope, and most significantly, they had to destroy parts of the necropolis. We know this not just from legend, but from the stones, from excavations done centuries later beneath the basilica's floor. There, archaeologists found the remains of the ancient necropolis burial chambers and painted walls. Latin inscriptions, bones still resting in silence. Constantine's builders had leveled graves, covered tombs with earth, and laid the foundation of Christianity's holiest church directly above them. But here's the question. Why? Why would Constantine choose a pagan graveyard of all places for his new basilica? Was it simply because of Peter's burial spot? Or was there something deeper, something symbolic? Some scholars suggest it was a deliberate act of supersession, a way for Christianity to conquer the old world not with swords, but with stone and symbol. By building over the necropolis, the church was not just honoring Peter, it was replacing the pagan world, laying holy ground upon unholy dead, turning a marginal slope into the new spiritual center of the West. But it came at a cost. The memory of those ordinary Romans, the ones buried centuries before Peter was erased, their names worn down, their offerings forgotten, their resting place paved over, and still their bones remained beneath the marble, beneath the candles and altars, beneath the feet of pilgrims, a silent city beneath the living one. Which brings us back to the beginning. Why build here? Why disturb the dead? Why layer one faith on top of another? Was it a claim of dominance or an act of devotion? Or did the early Christians know, perhaps better than we do, that memory is never clean, that history is always buried in layers, and that every sacred thing rests on the bones of something older? And if that's true, what else lies beneath the foundations of our beliefs? The old stones didn't scream when they were broken. No voice rose from the tombs as they were cut in two. No hand reached out from the centuries to protest when Constantine's masons began their work on Vatican Hill. But that doesn't mean nothing was lost. It began quietly. Around 319 AD, Constantine had given his orders. A basilica was to rise where Peter's bones had once lain, but the site was no open field. It was dense with burial chambers, brick and mortar mausoleums lined up along the old Roman roads, layered like honeycomb across the slope of the hill. Many of the graves were humble, others were finely crafted, containing family vaults, decorative frescoes, and Latin inscriptions honoring the dead to level the ground. Constantine's builders had to do something no Roman engineer would have taken lightly. They had to cut through and over graves, had to pour tons of fill soil, rubble, and construction debris on top of carefully arranged family tombs. They weren't just building a church, burying memory itself. Some of these tombs were preserved, sealed beneath the new foundation. Others were shattered or destroyed. Even for the time, it was a dramatic gesture to Romans' ancestor. Worship and veneration of the dead had always been deeply sacred, even among pagans. To plow through tombs, particularly those with names and offerings still visible, was a kind of spiritual violence. And yet, Constantine pressed on. His workers constructed an enormous retaining wall on the western side of the hill, and then filled in the entire slope behind it with earth, stones, and the crushed remnants of the old necropolis. The church they built on top the original St. Peter's Basilica was massive for its time. It had 5 aisles, a central nave, a transept, and a monumental atrium. And at the far end, where the altar stood, it was said that the bones of St. Peter were buried, marked by a shrine. That shrine, known to early Christians as the Tropaeon, was thought to be a simple monumenta, kind of trophy of faith built by Peter's followers. Over time, tradition held that this spot had always been honored, always remembered, but the truth is harder to pin down. For nearly 3 centuries, Christian worship was often private and, at times, persecuted. There were no public records or blueprints, just memory passed through communities' memory, layered like dust. And so Constantine's Basilica became a symbol of triumph. Not just religious, but political. It was built over the graves of the forgotten, declaring that the faith of Christ had outlasted Rome's gods. Every stone whispered conquest. Every marble column spoke of victory, not through war, but through replacement. But what of those buried below? In 1939, centuries after Constantine's Basilica had been replaced by the modern St. Peter's Basilica, an accidental discovery shifted everything. Pope Pius XI had requested to be buried in the Vatican grottos, near what was believed to be Peter's tomb. As workers began excavation beneath the high altar, they uncovered a surprising find, a complex network of ancient Roman tombs. Not just a few bones or fragments, but a full section of the 2nd and 3rd century necropolis, sealed and hidden beneath the foundations of the church. The discovery was momentous, though at first kept quiet. Over the next decade, archaeologists carefully explored the site. What they found was a row of mausoleums, each with preserved frescoes, mosaics, and inscriptions. Many were richly decorated, indicating that the necropolis housed not just the poor, but also middle class and elite Roman families. Names were found: Marcus, Abusius, Flavius Agricola, Unia, and others, etched into the walls, alongside references to Roman deities, funerary rites, and even some early Christian symbols. One chamber in particular caught the attention of the researchers. It contained an inscribed wall partially damaged, referring to Peter, with fragments of Greek letters and Christian graffiti surrounding it. This became known as the graffiti wall, and behind it, in a small niche, were found bones. Were these Peter's bones? The Vatican eventually confirmed they believed so. But the bones, curiously, were from a man in his 60s, consistent with Peter's age, at deathbed, removed from the original grave and relocated to this niche centuries later. Had they been moved to protect them, or had later Christians simply guessed, relying on the accumulated weight of tradition? Either way, the site once again confirmed the layering of history. Pagan tombs, Christian graves, imperial construction, and beneath it all, the silent persistence of forgotten lives. What stands out most from the archaeological findings isn't just the possibility of Peter's burial, but the sheer density of death beneath the Vatican. Dozens of family tombs, each once cared for, are now buried under tons of Christian sanctity. Inscriptions asking for remembrance now lie under a basilica that remembers something else entirely. A kind of spiritual amnesia built in stone. But why did this matter to the early church? It's easy to think of the basilica as simply a monument to faith, but it was also political. By placing the church's most sacred site atop a Roman burial ground, Constantine and his successors were redefining the center of power. No longer was the Roman Forum the heart of the world. Now it was this hill, a place that had once been peripheral, marginal, even profane. It's symbolic when you think about it. Christianity didn't just claim space in the empire, it inverted it. The margins became the center. The site of death became the site of resurrection. The forgotten tomb became the foundation of the church. But memory doesn't vanish just because we build over it. The stones beneath St. Peter's still hold their stories. Some tombs include dedications from wives to husbands, from parents to children. One marble slab, cracked and faded, reads simply, "To the spirits of the dead, Marcus, beloved husband, may you rest in light." No mention of gods or dogma. Just love. How many thousands, like Marcus, are now lost beneath the Basilica. And how many were never identified again once the earth was filled and the tombs covered and the names erased. Even today, most visitors to St. Peter's walk over these graves without knowing it. Tourists photograph the dome, admire Bernini's columns, or gaze at Michelangelo's Pieta, but few realize that beneath their feet lies an ancient city of the dead. No markers, no plaques, just layers of faith and time and silence. So what does it mean when a religion builds its holiest site over another's sacred ground? Is it erasure or transformation? Does it honor the past by including it? Or does it conquer the past by burying it? We may never fully know what the early Christians believed about that hill, but we know what they built, and we know what they built over it. It's not just Peter's bones that anchor St. Peter's Basilica. It is the countless anonymous ones beside him, the ones who never asked to be remembered by a church they never knew. The ones who died under Roman skies and were buried by Roman hands, and who now lie beneath a sea of pilgrims who will never know their names, and yet, in a strange way, they were never fully erased. When the archaeologists dug through the grottos in the mid-20th century, they didn't find just Peter. They found Rome, pagan Rome, the real Rome, the one of grief, of family, of forgotten lives. Perhaps that's the most honest thing buried beneath the Vatican. Not a single saint, but a chorus of ordinary dead. And maybe, in some strange way, Peter would have understood. After all, wasn't he buried as one of them? A man of no title, no riches, no temple, just dust, just a name, etched into memory, just one among many. But what if, in layering his story over theirs, we haven't just sanctified the hill? What if we've silenced it? And if so, is it too late to hear what the hill still remembers? As the years folded, one atop another, what had begun as a cautious memory of a martyr named Peter became the cornerstone of a religion's authority. But still, the question lingered like incense in an ancient chapel. Did anyone ever truly remember the others buried beside him? The rise of the Christian world didn't happen overnight. After Constantine, other emperors built on his legacy. The church became a fixture of political life. Bishops grew in influence. Doctrines were sharpened. Councils convened. But amid all this transformation, the Vatican Hill remained a silent witness to what had come before. A place of old bones. A burial ground turned battleground for memory. And what a strange battleground it was. For by the 6th century, most people have forgotten that the ground beneath St. Peter's was once a necropolis. The shrine became a place of pilgrimage, not just for the faithful, but for emperors, kings, and clerics who hoped to pray near the bones of the apostle. Over time, the original Constantinian basilica began to fade with age, its timbers warped, its mosaics dulled, its stones cracked, and yet the tradition endured. Here lies Peter, they said, the rock upon which the church is built. But what about the other rocks? The ones beneath the altar, beneath the mosaic floors, beneath centuries of doctrine and ritual. During the High Middle Ages, few people gave thought to what lay below. The idea that the Vatican had once been a pagan graveyard had faded into obscurity. Church historians focused on the apostolic succession, the theological meanings of Peter's primacy, and the heavenly authority granted to the church by virtue of that burial. Still, rumors stirred occasionally, whispers among monastics, half-forgotten tales passed down by stonemasons and caretakers. Some said the ground trembled at night. Others claimed to hear voices when the church was silent. But Rome, a city always layered in legend, had no shortage of ghost stories. In truth, the silence was far more mundane, not eerie, just overlooked. In the Renaissance, Pope Julius II ordered the old Constantinian Basilica torn down and replaced with a grander, more magnificent version, what we now know as the modern St. Peter's Basilica. Artists like Michelangelo, Raphael, and Bramante were called upon. The dome soared into the sky. The columns grew thick and perfect. The marble was polished, sacred, brilliant. No one asked what was disturbed beneath it. The builders dug foundations, moved stone, laid new crypts and chapels. The grottos beneath the basilica were redesigned to house the tombs of popes. Cardinals were buried in gilded vaults. Pilgrims pressed their hands against the walls, hoping to absorb something holy. But again, few thought of the necropolis. It remained buried beneath centuries of forgetting. That is, till the 20th century, when Pope Pius XI died in 1939. He requested to be buried as close as possible to St. Peter, and so began a project of careful excavation. What the workers found shocked them. Tomb after tomb, the mausoleums, still decorated with frescoes. Inscriptions, some clearly Christian, others unmistakably pagan. Names lost to history reappeared in paint and stone. The church, at first, kept the discoveries quiet. It was wartime. The world had enough chaos. But slowly, as scholars were allowed to investigate, a fuller picture emerged. This had never been empty land. The Vatican was not simply built atop Peter. It was built atop Rome, and not the glorious Rome of emperors, but the ordinary one, the Rome of bakers, stonemasons, freed slaves, teachers, widows, and children. Their tombs had stood there long before the church arrived, and now they had surfaced again, silent but undeniable. One of the most moving discoveries was the tomb of a Roman woman named Amelia. Her name appeared in red paint across a modest stone archway. Inside, her bones had been carefully laid to rest, wrapped in linen, surrounded by small vessels of oil and wine offerings to the manes, the Roman spirits of the dead. Amelia had likely died in the early 2nd century, perhaps during a harsh winter or an outbreak of fever. Her family buried her with love, with ritual, with the hope that she would be remembered for nearly 1,800 years. She was not. Now, beneath St. Peter's dome, her name had returned, a whisper among the saints. But the rediscovery raised a theological question no one was eager to answer. What does it mean that the holiest site in Catholicism rests on the bones of pagans? Some tried to explain it away, saying it was coincidence, or that God's providence had chosen this site to sanctify the unclean. Others, more thoughtful, suggested that this was how faith often works, by layering over what came before, by transforming the profane into the sacred. But the truth is quieter. It lies not in dogma, but in dirt. The Vatican, as it stands today, is a monument not just to Peter, but to forgetting, to the way we bury what no longer serves our narrative. The pagans were not defeated by Christianity through violence here, but through sediment, through silence, through being paved over. And yet, when the archaeologists cleared away the centuries, they found more than stones. They found stories, In one tomb, a child's footprint had been preserved in the floor, pressed into soft clay before it had hardened. Perhaps the child had run through the tomb while it was under construction, giggling, unaware that his misstep would last for millennia. In another, a faint carving on the wall read, "For my sister Claudia, who loved flowers." No title, no empire, just affection. These were the people over whom Peter was buried. The ones who died believing in different gods or no gods. The ones whose names faded as Peter's grew. The ones whose stories were erased except by accident. And so we come to a strange kind of reckoning. If history is built on forgetting, then what does it mean to remember now? What does it mean to walk through St. Peter's Basilica and realize that beneath the gold and glory are bones that never asked to be part of someone else's story? They do not protest, but they remain. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the greatest secret of Vatican Hill is not theological at all. Maybe it is simply this, that no belief system, no matter how grand, can fully erase what came before it. That every stone laid in reverence rests upon another once laid in grief. That every church, every empire, every doctrine is just one more layer on the hill, and beneath it all, dust, quiet, human dot, the Vatican built over a pagan graveyard, not to hide it but because, in the end, it had no choice. The past was already there. It always is. It was there when Peter was crucified, when Constantine built, when Michelangelo painted, when pilgrims kissed the marble floor. It is there still, and it will be there long after the basilica crumbles. Bones do not disappear. They wait, and perhaps, somewhere beneath that holy altar, Amelia still dreams of spring, before the hymns, before the incense, before the flicker of candlelight in cathedral arches. It was only the slope of earth, and the sound of the Tiber. The western side of ancient Rome, what we now call Vatican Hill, did not rise with majesty. It was a modest incline, the kind of place overlooked by poets and generals alike. Yet, in the time of the early empire, it became a final home for thousands who had no palaces, no tombs carved in marble, only names carved in clay. This is the story of the necropolis before Peter. It begins not with sainthood, but with dust in Roman tradition. The dead had to be buried outside the pomerium, the sacred boundary of the city. This law dated back to the earliest kings, passed down not for sanitation, but for spiritual purity. The living walked within the boundary. Dead had their own roads, their own spaces, own silence. Vatican Hill, steeped in morning fog and facing away from the city's clamor, was just such a place. Its location, along the ancient Via Cornelia and near the Via Triumphalis, made it ideal for burial. These roads stretched toward the northwest, toward Etruria, and were lined with tombs for miles. The practice was simple. The dead were to be remembered. That meant their tombs had to be seen. It's why the Romans built graves not in hidden fields, but along public roads, so that, even in death, their names would be spoken by passers-by. Vatican Hill became one such road of remembrance. If you had walked it in the 1st or 2nd century AD, you would have seen a long stretch of burial plots, columbaria with niches for cremation urns, family tombs built in red brick, and above them inscriptions. Names like Lucius, Valerius, Aelia Faustina, Gaius, Junius, Tiberia, Paula, sometimes with their trade listed: baker, soldier, freedwoman, wine-seller. Some tombs were topped with sculptures of reclining figures, eyes open as if still watching the street. Others bore small windows, meant to let in a sliver of sunlight and to allow the living to pour libations into the tomb's oil. Milk, honey, wine. The offerings were meant to nourish the dead in their afterlife. It was not eerie. It's not strange, too. The Romans, death was a continuation, and Vatican Hill was their bridge between worlds. The burial structures varied in size and grandeur, as one might expect in any human city. The wealthiest families constructed multi-room mausoleums with painted walls and stucco ceilings, with benches where visitors could sit and commune with their ancestors. These were not empty rooms, but memory houses. Some included altars, others contained inscriptions written in Greek, a sign of Rome's cultural borrowing of the origins of the deceased. But alongside the wealthy were the humble tombs of slaves and freedmen, sometimes buried together. Roman society was stratified, but in death, proximity offered a kind of equality. Tombs were packed tightly, almost touching, often rearranged and rebuilt when new families arrived. And so, layer upon layer, the necropolis grew not outward, but inward and downward. By the 2nd century AD, cremation was slowly giving way to inhumation. Romans were beginning to bury whole bodies again rather than burning them. Scholars debate why, perhaps due to changes in philosophy, religion, or foreign influence. But the result was more complexity underground. More bones, more chambers, more quiet stories, and the hill kept filling. One structure, now known as Mausoleum H, belonged to a woman named Flavia Aureliana. Her tomb, found centuries later beneath the Vatican grottos, was modest but deliberate. The walls were painted red. A single shelf held a small clay lamp. Her name was written in white, carefully, across the brick. We know nothing else of her. No family tree, no cause of death, just a name in stone and the silence of centuries. How many people like her laid their names known only to their lovers, their children, their gods? And yet, this necropolis was not a city of gloom. It was layered with life, even in death. Some tombs were decorated with garden imagery, vines, birds, as fountains meant to comfort the dead or remind the living of what was lost. Others included painted myths, Hercules at the crossroads, Orpheus charming the animals, Persephone rising from the underworld. These were not Christian symbols, at least, not yet, but they spoke to longing, to the idea that death was not an end, but a threshold. Some inscriptions even pleaded for kindness from the living. Stranger, do not defile this tomb. May your own journey end in peace. There is something deeply human about those words. A voice from 1,800 years ago, still asking for dignity. And then, slowly, change began. It didn't happen with banners or swords. It came with whispers. The quiet rise of Christianity. By the late 2nd and early 3rd century, scattered Christian families had begun to bury their dead among the pagans. They had little power, few resources. They weren't allowed to build grand churches or declare sacred ground, so they used what was already there. In necropolis, some early Christian tombs were indistinguishable from pagan ones, except for a symbol, a fish scratched into plaster, a chiro hidden in a corner, a dove or anchor painted where a god might have stood. In one tomb, a Latin inscription reads, "In peace, Marcus rests. He believed in the resurrection." No more, no less. These early Christian graves were not numerous, but they were present, and their proximity to the traditional Roman dead tells us something, that these faiths did not begin in opposition, but in overlap. The living still poured oil, still whispered names, still traced fingers along stone. Only the words changed, and, in this quiet coexistence, Vatican Hill became a peculiar meeting place, a threshold not only between life and death, but between belief systems. The pagan gods watched from frescoes as Christians buried their own nearby. For decades, perhaps centuries, this tension remained unspoken. The dead did not quarrel, but above ground. The world was changing. As Christianity spread and was eventually legalized under Constantine, the meaning of the necropolis began to shift. The hill that once offered anonymity to forgotten dead became sacred again. This time, for entirely new reasons. One of those reasons was memory. The early Christians remembered that Peter had died under Nero's persecution, that he had been crucified near the circus just across from Vatican Hill, that his bones had been buried somewhere in this soil, unmarked but not forgotten. And so the memory drew them here, not to the tombs of their pagan ancestors, but to the possibility of their apostles' grave. The necropolis became not only a burial site, but a pilgrimage of the mind, a place where history folded over itself, where meanings could be rewritten. But this rewriting came at a cost, for in order to build a basilica, Constantine's basilica, the necropolis, had to be buried. Literally, most of the tombs were not destroyed outright. They were filled in, covered with earth and debris, used as foundation. Others were cut through, their walls broken to lay new stones. The living made their mark atop the dead. Faith became architecture, and history became silence. No one asked the tombs for permission. By the time the new basilica was complete in the 4th century, few remembered the names etched into those underground walls. They walked across new floors, lit new candles, sang new songs. The hill had changed, and the necropolis, it slept for over 1,600 years. The dead watched the river in darkness, but they never left. When modern excavations unearthed the necropolis beneath St. Peter's, archaeologists were stunned by how intact many of the tombs were, preserved by accident, not remembered, but not erased either. A woman named Unia Modesta, whose tomb was found beneath a corridor of the basilica, had this line engraved above her name: "I lived simply. I died simply. May this stone be enough." And so it was. Her name endures, does her stone. And perhaps that is all anyone ever wanted, to be remembered, to be left undisturbed. But Vatican Hill did not offer that. It offered layers, one upon another. Roman upon Roman, pagan upon Christian, stone upon bone. And now we must ask, did the necropolis shape Christianity? Or did Christianity simply bury it? The dead do not speak in Rome, but they leave instructions, sometimes in verse, sometimes in stone, sometimes just in the shape of a room. As archaeologists crept beneath the marble floor of St. Peter's in the mid-20th century, torches flickering against ancient red brick, they were not simply entering tombs. They were entering homes of memory, spaces once filled with the scent of oil lamps, the murmur of prayer, and the careful, quiet footsteps of mourners who knew how to live among the dead. The necropolis of Vatican Hill was more than a cemetery. It was a neighborhood of the past, and like any neighborhood, it had its patterns, its wealthy families, its humble corners, its artistic flourishes, its plain walls. But what made it strange, what made it holy and forgotten all at once, was how it vanished before it disappeared. Beneath the basilica, the necropolis was alive with the presence of the past. Families constructed tombs not as final endings, but as resting stations along a greater journey. They were meant to be visited, maintained, refreshed. The dead were never entirely gone. Their spirits lingered in the stone, in the paintings, in the inscriptions left for future generations to read. One such family, Valeri, left behind a remarkably preserved mausoleum, now known as Mausoleum F. Their burial site, discovered during the 1940s excavations, stood out for its wealth and design. Inside, the walls were painted with elaborate red and blue frescoes. Vines, birds, and even stylized portraits adorned the chamber. One panel depicted the goddess Diana in a forest, looking back toward the viewer, forever caught in the moment between movement and stillness. Perhaps it was meant to comfort the dead, a reminder of beauty in transition. The Valeri tomb included multiple sarcophagi, carved from marble and bearing names of family members. The patriarch, Lucius Valerius Proclus, had his name engraved in neat Latin script along with a modest epitaph to Lucius, who lived with justice. To Lucius, who honored his house, Quid, who remain, do not forget. And yet, they were forgotten. For more than 1,000 years, Lucius and his family lay in silence, sealed beneath layers of basilica and legend. This forgetting was not malicious. It was architectural. When Constantine's builders began leveling the hill to prepare for the basilica in the 4th century, they faced a problem. The terrain was uneven, riddled with tombs, tunnels, chambers, and mausolea. To construct a level surface for the church, they had to pour in metric tons of fill rubble, soil, broken brick, crushed fragments of the very structures that once made up the necropolis. Many of the larger tombs were sealed, not destroyed. Others were broken open, emptied, and used as structural space. The Valeri tomb survived by luck. Its brickwork was sturdy, its position just deep enough to avoid the full weight of the new church's foundations. Other families weren't as fortunate. One tomb known only as Tomb O was found smashed, its inscriptions lost, its frescoes reduced to powder. Inside, only a few fragments of pottery remained, with no names to speak for the dead. Archaeologists found a child's molar buried in the rubble, no more than 6 years old, an anonymous death, sealed again. How many families were erased by the basilica's rise? How many stories never saw light again? And yet, some tombs fought to stay visible, even through the centuries. Mausoleum M, discovered in a far corner of the necropolis, bore an unusual dedication carved into plaster. If I am buried under stone, may my name rise again. And rise it did. The tomb, largely intact, housed a freedwoman named Talia Fortunata. Her name appears twice, once on the door and again near her sarcophagus, written in a looser, more informal hand. Some believe the second was etched by her daughter. There's a faint handprint next to it. It's too small to be an adult. There's something haunting about that, the idea of a child pressing her hand into wet plaster, reaching across time to say, I was here. I loved her. Vatican Hill wasn't just a place for elite Romans or wealthy merchants. It became, by the 3rd century, a patchwork of the empire's many classes. Soldiers, slaves, midwives, shopkeepers, and former gladiators found their resting places here. In some tombs, archaeologists discovered remnants of tools or trade emblems, a surgeon's scalpel, a baker's stamp, a lead pipe used by a plumber. One tomb was marked with an iron stylus, a simple writing instrument placed near the skull. The inscription read, to Aurelius, who taught letters, a teacher who left his mark. In another, a man named Publius Cornelius Scapula was buried with a small bronze helmet, partially crushed by centuries of soil. His tomb bore no mention of battle, just a line. He guarded the city. Now he rests. These were not men who expected sainthood. They asked only to be remembered. But what happens when remembering becomes selective? When Constantine ordered the basilica built over the hill, he likely believed he was honoring Peter, and indeed, 2 Christians of the 4th century. That was enough. The apostles' bones, if they were there, transformed the land from burial ground to holy ground. But no one documented what became of the other graves. Some tombs were cataloged and blessed before being sealed. Others, especially those without obvious Christian symbols, were considered irrelevant, perhaps even profane. The hill's pagan identity was slowly overwritten. In time, the very term necropolis faded from the Vatican's vocabulary, became the grottos, the crypts, the foundations of Peter's house. But beneath it all, the old city slept today. What survives of the necropolis is a narrow corridor of the original burial site. Visitors who descend into the Vatican's underbelly walk through low-lit pathways flanked by ancient brick and stucco. The tombs are kept humid to preserve paint. The air is cool and still. No windows. just a slow echo of footsteps and the occasional whisper of a guide. You cannot touch the walls, though you'll want to. You'll see names carved by hands that are now dust. You'll pass urns that once held ashes of citizens who bought their freedom. You'll see frescoes of vines that haven't faded vivid red and green against white plaster, painted when Christianity was still illegal. And as you walk, you'll realize these people never knew Peter. They didn't die for faith. They died of fevers, childbirth, age, or accident. They were buried by siblings, neighbors, friends. Their gods had many names. Their funerary rites involved wine, not wafers. Their rituals included coins for Karen, not prayers to saints, but they are here, beneath the center of Christianity. Not by design, just by history. And so, the necropolis remains a paradox. City of the forgotten under a shrine to memory. Place where the boundaries between belief systems are not sharp lines, but gentle overlaps. Pagan tombs with Christian graffiti. Christian tombs beside Roman ones. In one chamber, a fish symbol appears next to a depiction of Hercules, proof that even the walls didn't know where one faith ended and another began. The Vatican seldom speaks of the necropolis in theological terms. It's easier to present it as archaeological, interested curiosity beneath the grandeur. But to walk through it is to understand something deeper. That history is not a single story. It's a collection of silences stacked atop one another. And those silences whisper. If you listen carefully, you might hear them. The scratch of a chisel carving a name. The flick of a brush painting ivy on plaster. The soft weeping of a child at her mother's grave. The quiet hush of earth closing in. They didn't expect to be under St. Peter, but they are. And the question remains, does sanctity rest in what we build, or in what we choose not to erase? When modern pilgrims cross St. Peter's Square, their thoughts often turn upward toward the soaring dome. The colossal statues of saints, the sunlight spilling across polished marble. Few imagine the weight of what lies beneath their feet. Fewer still sense the press of thousands of names lost not to time, but to triumph. For the necropolis beneath Vatican Hill was not merely buried. It was buried twice. First, by nature, through centuries of sediment, weather, collapse, and organic, dequaternary erosion and time's erosion alike. Second, and more significantly, by design, by the act of forgetting, by a church that needed sanctity to be singular, narrative to be linear, and memory to be clean. But bones do not obey stories. They stay. They wait. Let's return to the beginning gist. Before the Basilica was built, the 4th century engineers who arrived to prepare the ground were faced with a complex and sensitive reality. The slope of Vatican Hill was dotted with tombs, not scattered, dense, side by side, wall to wall. These were not catacombs, hidden and dark. These were surface-level mausolea, built to be seen, to level the site for Constantine's Basilica. The builders didn't remove the tombs, they entombed them again. They constructed retaining walls, packed and filled dirt, and turned elaborate Roman burial streets into foundations. This approach was pragmatic. It was architectural, and it was efficient, but it wasn't innocent. The tombs were sealed often intentionally, without records, without cataloging, without honoring the inscriptions that had once pleaded for remembrance. Some family names vanished that very year. Others would take over a millennium to be seen again. And so we arrive at the most unsettling irony. The Christian church that taught the value of resurrection had, in constructing itself, buried the memories of the very people who believed in afterlife. But memory does strange things in Rome. In 1949, a team of Vatican archaeologists led by Monsignor Ludwig Kaz and Professor Enrico Josi continued their delicate work beneath the altar. The necropolis was slowly revealing itself after 15 centuries, chamber by chamber, name by name. One of their most remarkable discoveries came not from grandeur, but from modesty. In a tight corridor, between two mausolea, barely wide enough to pass. They uncovered the entrance to what they called Mausoleum E. The inscription was faint, weathered by time, and barely legible. But under careful light and magnification, it read, "To Severa and Marcus, friends in life, partners in memory." The walls were painted with simple geometric shapes. No deities, no Christian symbols. Just soft lines in ochre and green. In the corner of the chamber stood two urns, one smaller than the other, both untouched. Inside, the ashes of Severa and Marcus. K. Their remains had not been moved. K. Not desecrated. Just forgotten their entire existence for the modern world. It consisted of 4 words and 2 vessels, but in that small space, something stirred, a kind of presence, not mystical, historical. The awareness that these people had stood here once, decided on the shape of their tomb, painted the walls, placed each urn, K, and then trusted memory to do the rest. And memory failed, or did it? Because now, after centuries, their names were spoken again. Severa, Marcus, there's power in that. Even if the world has changed beyond recognition, even if their gods are gone, their empire crumbled, their children buried and reburied, someone still speaks their names. But for every Severa and Marcus, there are hundreds, perhaps thousands, whose names remain sealed in darkness. The Vatican necropolis, qua, as it stands today, is only partially excavated. The area open to scholars and limited visitors is a fraction of the original site. Political concerns, architectural limitations, and religious sensitivities have made full exploration impossible. Some tombs lie directly beneath critical basilica supports. Others were partially uncovered and then reburied for preservation. In some cases, decisions were made not to pursue further excavation out of respect or out of unease, because not all bones beneath the basilica are quiet. In 1950, during continued excavations near the presumed site of St. Peter's tomb, collection of bones was found in a marble-lined niche behind the graffiti wall. The bones were fragmented, jumbled, and not in their original grave. Analysis revealed they belonged to a man in his 60s. It's consistent with tradition about Peter, but the bones had been moved, wrapped in purple cloth, embroidered with gold thread. Why? No one knows for certain. Had someone relocated Peter's remains during a time of persecution? Had they been reinterred later to align with evolving doctrine? Or were they simply the bones of another man misidentified, then mythologized? The Vatican declared them authentic in 1968. Pope Paul VI confirmed they were identified in a way we can hold to be convincing. But the tombs around Peter's shrine remain sealed. They contain pagan families. They contain early Christians. They contain people who would not have seen themselves as part of the same story. And yet, here they are, layered together like sediment in a riverbed. And this is where the unease begins. Because if the church had to bury so many voices to elevate Peter's, what else has been buried? What else lies underneath the official story? In 2003, a team of archaeologists revisiting Mausoleum Q found unusual carvings etched into the brick after its construction, likely by a visitor, or perhaps gravedigger. The Latin was rough, but readable. They have forgotten you, have not. Who wrote it? No one knows, but it's the kind of message that lingers. Quiet accusation against history. The Christianization of Vatican Hill was not simply a construction project. It was a rewriting of spatial memory, redefinition of sacred space. What was once a public necropolis became private sanctum, What had been a road of remembrance became a crypt of power, and what had been many stories became one. But stories leak. They drip through cracks. They rise through stone. In 2011, during restoration work on a stairwell near the Vatican grottos, workers discovered a broken inscription slab used as a foundation stone, repurposed during the medieval period. The inscription, now upside down, read, "This place belongs to the freedwoman Dativa. Disturb not her rest." She had not been disturbed in the traditional sense. She'd been verted, built into someone else's staircase, forgotten then, repurposed. Her name was never meant to be seen again. And yet, here we are, reading it, saying it, Dativa, in a strange way. Perhaps that's the only resurrection we can promise the dead, to say their names aloud, to see them, even briefly, through the dust. So what do we make of Vatican Hill? A site of martyrdom, a center of Christian power, a place of breathtaking art and architecture, but also a cemetery, a layered story, a reminder that no ground is neutral, that every monument rests upon choices, some remembered, some erased, and perhaps the greatest irony is this, that the church built to enshrine memory has become a place layered in forgetting, not willful forgetting, but structural, ritual, convenient, and yet, through cracks and careful scholarship, the necropolis speaks again. Each tomb, uncovered, adds another thread to the tapestry, not to unravel faith, but to ground it, to show that even holiness is built on human soil. The final question is not about Peter. It's about the thousands beneath him. Not where did they go? We know where they are, but rather what happens when those we build over begin to rise, not in rebellion, but in remembrance. There was no thunderclap, no dramatic overturning of altars, no sweeping of idols into flames. That's not how it happened. Rome did not become Christian in a day, and the gods did not fall all at once. They stood for a while tall and patient, watching from their temple perches as the crowds grew smaller and the prayers quieter. They watched as new names took root in whispers, as crosses appeared in doorways, as processions once meant for Saturn or Juno began subtly to invoke a new name, Christ. And while this slow transformation unfolded in the grand temples and bustling forums of ancient Rome, something quieter, something stranger was happening on the edges, on the slope of Vatican Hill. Far from the central fire of the Roman Forum, the old gods watched a different kind of struggle, not between emperors and bishops, but between space and silence, between memory and forgetting, between the temples of the living, and the tombs of the dead. This was not a war of swords, it was a war of stones. Let's go back again. Rome, late 2nd century AD. The empire is still officially pagan. Jupiter reigns over the capital. Mars, Venus, Diana, and Mercury are still invoked in state rituals, but cracks are forming. Philosophy is growing uneasy. Eastern cults are spreading, and something else, still illegal, still whispered, is beginning to stir. A movement of the poor, the enslaved, the marginal. A religion built not on temples, but on tables. Christianity, its followers, once scattered, are now a presence, still small, still fragile, but present. And on Vatican Hill, they find space not in churches, for there are none yet, but in the margins, in the burial places, in the tombs. This is where the quiet war begins. The necropolis of Vatican Hill, as we've seen, was dense with Roman burials. Some were grand mausolea built to rival small villas. Others were humble, tile-covered graves, painted bricks, urns marked with a name and date. These were spaces made sacred, not by gods, but by grief. Family grief, daily, ordinary loss. And in these spaces, slowly, the meaning of sacredness began to change. At first, Christ and pagan burials appeared side by side, nearly indistinguishable. The dead were buried in the same styles, same architecture, same materials. But occasionally, you would find a subtle difference. A painted fish instead of a laurel, a shepherd instead of Hercules, an inscription that read, "Not in the arms of the gods, but awaiting resurrection." These were the first signs that belief was shifting, and while the temples of Jupiter and Mars still glistened in marble across the river, another kind of monument was taking root. Memory in obscurity. Christian families could not build temples, but they could mark tombs. And in the Roman world, to mark a tomb was to declare sacred space. This posed a challenge, because sacred space was already occupied in the pagan worldview. Burial grounds were not just zones of remembrance, they were zones of ritual. The Parentalia Festival, for example, was a 9-day event every February when Roman families would visit the tombs of their ancestors. They'd offer food, drink, and flowers. They'd sit and dine near the graves, share stories, clean the stones. The dead were not banished, they were invited to linger. Temples, on the other hand, were places for gods. Places where the numen, the divine force, could be housed, fed, and honored. A temple could not be built just anywhere. It had to be sanctioned, purified, observed by augurs for omens and signs. So, when Christians began turning tombs into places of worship, even before it was legal, they were quietly violating the old spatial order. They didn't tear down temples. They didn't desecrate idols. They just ignored them. Instead, they gathered in crypts. They sang hymns in mausolea. They turned the act of burial into the act of church-building. Over time, these tombs became pilgrimage sites, tased not for wealth, but for presence. To pray near the bones of a martyr was to stand near holiness itself, on Vatican Hill. The bones of Peter, believed to be buried there after his martyrdom under Nero, became the ultimate destination, not marked by a temple, but by memory, by walking, by whispering, the shrine that eventually formed above Peter's grave. Known later as the Tropion, was not a grand building, just a modest structure, perhaps 2 columns with a niche between them. But it became something more. By the early 3rd century, this spot, uncertain in shape, certain in significance, was a sacred landmark for the growing Christian community. And here, the quiet war intensified, because while the temples still stood across the Tiber, another form of sanctity had taken root. And this sanctity did not need marble. It needed memory. By the time Constantine legalized Christianity in the early 4th century, this quiet revolution was well underway. The emperor, sensing the shift in power, acted not only to protect Christians, but to formalize their presence. And this is where the story changes from survival to symbolism. When Constantine ordered the building of the first basilica over Peter's tomb, he didn't choose a blank plot. He chose Vatican Hill, a slope saturated with pagan tombs, an necropolis. He could have built a church in the city center. He could have constructed a temple-like monument near the Forum or the Palatine. Instead, he chose a graveyard, a pagan one. Why? Historians argue over this. Some say it was a pragmatic choice. Peter's bones were there. Others say it was strategic to associate the church with Rome's imperial legacy through acts of construction. But perhaps it was something subtler, a symbolic act of quiet conquest. By building a basilica atop a necropolis, Constantine did something that had rarely been done in Roman history. He collapsed the distance between the divine and the dead. Temples were usually places of the living gods. Cemeteries were places of the gone. By turning a grave into a sanctuary, he redefined sacred geography. He turned the zone of death into the heart of faith. And in doing so, the pagan world was quite literally buried, not through iconoclasm, but through layering. Peter's Basilica became a temple, tomb, and a throne, all in one, and beneath it, old gods watched silently, because many of the tombs over which Constantine's basilica was built bore the markings of Rome's pantheon. Some had dedications to Mercury, the guide of souls, others to Venus, the protector of families. Some tombs even bore images of Isis, goddess of rebirth, evidence of the rich diversity of Roman spirituality. These gods were not removed. Their images were buried, their names overwritten. The Christians didn't fight the temples, they built over them. And the quiet war was won not in battle, but in settlement. Over the next few centuries, the shift became permanent. Christianity gained political power. Pagan rituals were banned. Temples were repurposed as churches, their columns reused in Christian basilicas. The pantheon of gods shrank from ubiquity to memory, then from memory to myth. And yet, below the grand dome of St. Peter's, those gods are still there, not in worship, but in residue, in the walls of forgotten tombs, in the names no longer spoken, in the silence between prayers. So, what do we make of this war, the one fought without swords? Was it a victory, or was it a burial? Because as the Christian faith rose, it absorbed more than it erased. It took the shape of Rome, even as it claimed to transcend it. Its basilicas mirrored Roman architecture. Its rituals mirrored imperial formality. Its saints began to look a lot like the gods they replaced, invoked for protection, for intercession, for help with storms and crops and illness. The temples died, but their echoes survived. And so we return to Vatican Hill, a place where the dead were once remembered in pagan rites, then remembered in Christian ones, then forgotten entirely. A hill that became a battleground not through blood, but through construction. And the question still whispers through the stones. When we build something sacred on top of something sacred, do we honor it or silence it? Silence it. It's easy to picture the grand moments in history, the council halls, the edicts, the marble-wrapped conversions. But real change, the kind that reshapes civilizations, often happens in quieter ways. Not in forums, but in courtyards. Not with proclamations, but with habits. And not always above ground. By the 4th century AD, the transformation of Rome from a pagan empire into a Christian world power was visible, but not absolute. Temples still stood. Statues of gods still loomed on pedestals across the forum. Festivals like Lupercalia and Saturnalia continued, albeit more quietly. But beneath all this, beneath the stone arches, beneath the basilicas still under construction, beneath the ceremonial processions that now included bishops alongside senators, something else had already taken root. The hill where the dead once rested, Vatican Hill, had begun to shift meaning entirely. The tomb had become the temple. Let's look again at what had been there before the first brick of Constantine's Basilica was ever laid. Vatican Hill was home to a vast necropolis, stretching from the Via Cornelia toward the slopes near the Circus of Nero. Tombs were built close together, some freestanding, others clustered in tight rows. They were stacked and layered over time like sediment in a riverbed. The dead were not anonymous. Each tomb tried to preserve something: a name, a face, a profession, a prayer. Romans honored the dead because they feared what happened when they were forgotten. A soul with no rights, no visitors, no memory was called insepultus and buried, even if physically interred. Such a spirit, according to belief, wandered restlessly, unable to find peace. It was a terror, not just of death, but of erasure. Families would visit their tombs regularly, sometimes dining there, cleaning the monuments, repainting faded inscriptions, even offering fresh garlands or food on feast days. The grave was not an ending, it was a point of contact, continuation of family obligation. The Christian practice of venerating martyrs subtly reimagined this idea. Instead of honoring families dead in general, the early Christians began to venerate specific individuals, those who had died for the faith. These were not just remembered, were revered. Martyrdom added a new meaning to death. It wasn't just the end of life, it was the beginning of sanctity. To be buried as a martyr was to become a focal point of divine power. Peter, Bishop of Rome, crucified under Nero, became the archetype. He was not entombed in a basilica. He was buried in a graveyard, quietly, among pagans, perhaps even without a name marker. But Christians remembered, and slowly, as the faith gained followers, the place of Peter's burial became something more than a memory. It became a destination. By the 3rd century, a small Tropian shrine was built above Peter's supposed grave. It wasn't a labyrinth, just a niche, possibly an edicule, with 2 marble columns and a horizontal slab. But it was enough. Pilgrims came, not in great waves yet, just a few. They would pray. They would touch the stones. Some would scratch symbols, nearby simple things. A fish, an alpha, an omega, a chiro. Graffiti that was half prayer, half declaration. He is here. And then came Constantine, when he issued the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, legalizing Christianity. He didn't just permit churches to be built, he financed them. The Christian community in Rome had survived persecution, imprisonment, and marginalization. It had also grown. Its leaders were now in dialogue with the emperor, and Peter, buried on Vatican Hill, was the key to their authority. But there was a problem. The site of Peter's grave was part of an active necropolis in Roman law and culture. This still mattered. Even though Christianity was rising, Roman burial law had not entirely vanished. Graves, even pagan ones, were to be respected. To build a basilica over the hill, Constantine's engineers had to violate more than terrain. They had to violate memory. And yet, they did it. They built a retaining wall to support the slope. They filled in the necropolis. They buried tombs, sealed them, and, in many cases, destroyed upper chambers to make space. The result was a platform large enough to support a massive church, the original St. Peter's Basilica. It was a stunning, architectural, and religious act. They did not remove the pagan tombs. They built over them. And so, without fanfare, the temple replaced the tomb, but not completely, because the necropolis was not entirely erased. It was entombed again, preserved beneath tons of earth. Like the old gods of Rome, the dead were buried under the rising edifice of Christian power. Above them, new kind of sacred space emerged. The basilica was not a temple in the Roman sense. It didn't house a statue of a god. It didn't include animal sacrifices or incense burned to Mercury or Mars. But it did something else. It invited the living to gather around the dead. Just as Romans once visited the tombs of their ancestors on the Parentalia, Christians now gathered at the shrine of Peter. They prayed. They wept. They sought healing, guidance, forgiveness. They did not sacrifice goats. They lit candles. They did not invoke Juno. They whispered Ave Maria. But in shape, in rhythm, in gesture, it was not so different. The Christian basilica was a tomb first, a place built atop the dead. And the dead, buried below in their forgotten tombs, still held the ground. Over time, other saints were buried nearby. Other martyrs, bishops, eventually popes. The hill became saturated with sanctity not because the church had purged the land, but because it had layered itself on top of what was already sacred to others. And here is where the quiet war revealed its deepest irony. Christianity did not destroy Roman spiritual geography. It absorbed it. It claimed the rhythms of remembrance, the gestures of mourning, its architecture of memory. Only the names changed. In the early centuries of the basilica's existence, visitors would enter not through a grand atrium as they do today, but through a long colonnade at the far end where the altar stood. They would see a raised area believed to be directly above Peter's grave. People knelt. They kissed the stones. They left messages, scratched into marble and plaster. Some were prayers. Others were declarations. One simply read, Pater, ora pro nobis. Peter, pray for us. These weren't addressed to a god. They were addressed to a man buried among pagans. And in that simple acta, prayer at a tomb, the temple became real. But it came at a cost. The surrounding necropolis, once alive with visits, memories, and flowers, faded from view. The names in the tombs were no longer spoken. The painted vines on the walls faded under soil. The children's footprints in the dust were covered with rubble. What had once been a place of many memories became a site of singular memory. Peter, Saint Peter. Everything else was background. And this is where the question lingers. Was the quiet war won by Christianity? Or was it simply a merging where the old habits of Rome slipped unnoticed into the new sanctity of the church? When we build our temples atop tombs, we do more than recycle space, we inherit memory, even the forgotten kind. So, what do we do with that inheritance? Do we peel it back? Do we ignore it? Or do we, like those first Christians, kneel over a name in the earth, whispering to someone who may never answer, but who shaped the ground beneath us anyway? If you were to draw a map of the Vatican today, one that included not just the city-state's visible buildings, but every layer beneath them, you would not end up with something neat or symmetrical. It would look more like a palimpsest, an ancient parchment overwritten so many times that all the words blur together. Above, the majestic dome of St. Peter's, the Renaissance piazza, the colonnades of Bernini. Below, a forgotten city of the dead, and buried even deeper than the stones buried in the air itself is a kind of quiet tension, not of conflict exactly, but of unresolved storylines. Temples turned into tombs, tombs turned into sanctuaries, sanctuaries layered over ancient rituals whose names have been lost. This is the ghost map of the Vatican. It's not made of haunting spirits or mythical curses. It's made of names no one says anymore, of painted walls that haven't seen sunlight in 1700 years, of footsteps that echo beneath marble without ever reaching the ears above. Let's walk through it. Begin in the present at the nave of St. Peter's Basilica. Tourists shuffle between marble statues and golden altars. Some stop to take photos of Michelangelo's Pieta. Others crane their necks to see the frescoes in the dome. Almost all are unaware that the basilica stands on an incline deliberately shaped to cover something older. Move beneath the marble floor, down into the Vatican grottos. Here, things grow darker. The air cools. The light is filtered through low archways. You find the tombs of popes, sealed in sarcophagi of porphyry or white marble. Latin inscriptions record their reigns and their devotion. Some have fresh flowers left by pilgrims. Others are undisturbed. But this isn't the end. Below the grottos lies something stranger still. The ancient pagan necropolis, earthed in the 1940s and now carefully preserved in silence. Access is restricted. The air is heavy with humidity to protect the frescoes. Only small groups are allowed in at a time, and only with trained guides. No photographs. No noise. The corridors are narrow built for memory, not movement. Each tomb is its own small room. In one, you'll see mosaics of peacocks and vines, symbols of eternal life even in the Roman world. In another, a painted figure reclines on a couch, Roman woman depicted in the afterlife as if in eternal leisure. Some tombs are pagan. Some are Christian. Some are neither, just familial, marked with the faded faces of people long dead before the church ever rose. You'll notice how quickly the art shifts from gods to metaphors, from deities to doves. One tomb bears the image of a shepherd holding a lamb, not explicitly Christian, but not Christian either. It's this ambiguity that defines the necropolis. It's not a battlefield of belief. It's a layering of longings. These people, pagan and Christian, alike wanted the same thing: to be remembered, to remain visible, to be visited, to be more than dust. And yet, they were buried twice, once in their tombs, and again when Constantine ordered the basilica. The builders filled in the gaps. The tombs were covered in rubble. Names were entombed in mortar. Inscriptions were sealed behind brick. What wasn't convenient to the story of Peter was covered, but not destroyed. And this is where the ghost map becomes vivid, because even today, archaeologists can trace the outlines of mausolea beneath the basilica's floor. They can read the names carved into brick by people who once walked these corridors as mourners, not scholars. Take, for instance, the tomb of Abusius Quintilianus, a man buried sometime around the year 160. His tomb, rediscovered in the 20th century, includes a long epitaph carved in Latin that reads like a letter to the future. I built this place for myself and my beloved. Let no one move our bones. Let no one paint over our names. We are not enemies of the gods. We are not enemies of men. We are simply gone. And yet, his tomb was sealed behind the foundation of Peter's Basilica. His name, like many others, was not preserved in church records. He wasn't a saint. He wasn't a martyr. He was just someone who wanted to be remembered, and somehow, by accident or providence, he was, because the stone held in the map beneath the basilica still carries his outline. The Vatican, as it stands today, is not simply a place of faith. It's a place of geological memory, a place where soil, stone, and structure hold a deeper history than any one narrative can contain. Think of how strange it is that the holiest building in Western Christianity is built upon a pagan necropolis. That the Pope gives speeches over the bones of Roman merchants and freed women. That millions visit Peter's tomb without realizing that he lies among bakers, butchers, midwives, and children whose names were once spoken at nightfall by a flickering lamplight. And what of the gods? What happened to them? They were not smashed. They were not burned. They were buried. Many temple ruins across the empire were cannibalized for their stone. But on Vatican Hill, the gods were not deconstructed. They were simply outlived in some of the tombs under the basilica. You can still see their symbols: Mercury with his caduceus, Venus with her dove, Jupiter with his eagle. No longer worshipped, but still present. Sometimes they appear alongside early Christian symbols: a dove next to an anchor, a fish beneath a palm frond, prayer to the mains next to a plea for resurrection. These are not contradictions, but they are layers. Because the real ghost map of the Vatican isn't one of conflict, it's one of continuity. Rome didn't replace the old world, it built over it. The church didn't erase the past, it inherited its structure. And the dead, they remained, as they always do, underneath everything. Let us pause here and consider something simple. Every step you take in St. Peter's Basilica, every polished tile, every echo under the domes, supported by the bones of forgotten people, not just Peter, thousands of them, people who died believing in Jupiter, or no God at all, people who were never told that one day a shrine would rise above their heads, people who left behind names, hoping someone would say them again. And here we are, saying them. Aebutius.Severa, Marcus.Tia.Dativa. Names rising through centuries of forgetting. It is tempting to view the transformation of Vatican Hill as a clean shift from pagan to Christian, from tomb to temple, from margin to center. But that's not what happened. What happened was messier, more human. The old was never truly removed. It was built into the walls. And today, Vatican stands not just as a symbol of Peter's faith, but as a palimpsest of thousands of hopes, rituals, and lives that came before it. The ghost map cannot be drawn on a single page. It's too wide, too deep. It exists in fragments and bricks, in bones, in faint inscriptions only visible by angled light. But it is there, and it tells us this, that the temple and the tomb were never separate, that sanctity does not come from marble, but from memory, and that even in forgetting, the dead remain beneath the dome, beneath the altars, beneath the prayer, waiting not for resurrection, not for judgment, just for someone to know, that they were here. were here. Long before Vatican Hill was called holy, it was already speaking, but not in songs. Not yet. It spoke in omens, in fragments of prophecy, in dreams whispered to those braver, desperate enough to listen. Before apostles and bishops stood at its peak, before Peter was buried under the slope, this hillside bore witness to another kind of sacred vision. To understand how saints came to replace sibyls, you must first understand what Rome considered sacred before Christianity claimed its soil, and on the margins of the ancient city, just beyond the sacred boundary, the voices of women were among the few, allowed to transcend the border between gods and men. They were called sibyls. You might think of the sibyls as oracles, but they were something stranger. They did not belong to temples. They were not priestesses of a single deity. They were independent, rooted in mystery. The Sibyl of Cumae, for instance, lived in a cave near Naples and was said to have lived for 1,000 years. Another, the Tiburtine Sibyl, delivered her riddles near modern-day Tivoli. There was no single place for the sibyls. They appeared in different regions, speaking for different gods or none at all. Some whispered verses that kings took as divine law. Others offered cryptic counsel to generals before war, but all were feared, and among them, one had ties to the soil of Vatican Hill, though no monumental oracle temple stood on the hill itself. The area had long been associated with strange rites that blurred the line between death and vision, between burial and revelation. This was no accident. In pre-Christian Rome, hills mattered. Some were crowned with temples, the Capitoline for Jupiter, the Palatine for imperial palaces, the Aventine for the plebeians and their gods. Others, like Vatican Hill, were set aside, outside the Pomerium, beyond the official border of the city. Such places often attracted mystery, and so, over time, the western slope facing the Tiber became associated with rites of the underworld, with necromancy, and with unorthodox spiritual practices that polite society looked down upon but never fully silenced. Even before Christianity, the slope was known not just as a graveyard, but as a place where the veil between worlds seemed thinner. It is said, in scattered Roman writings, that mystics would come to the hill to perform quiet ceremonies among the tombs. Libations poured, not just for the dead, but for guidance, for voices, for answers. This may not have been a center of Sibylline prophecy in the formal sense, but it existed on the periphery of sacred sound. And it was here on this threshold between Rome and not Rome that Christianity eventually laid its claim. It's worth pausing here to reflect on just how strange that claim really was. Peter was not buried in a basilica. He was buried, likely without ceremony, in the middle of a sprawling necropolis. And yet, over the next 3 centuries, his burial site transformed into a place of pilgrimage. Because of its architecture, there was none, but because of its memory. That act, that idea, was revolutionary. Rome had long been a city of structured worship. Gods had temples. Temples had rules. Sacred spaces were established by priests, marked with augury, purified by ritual. Christianity broke all of that. It declared the place of a man's death to be sacred. It turned his tomb into a temple, and in doing so, it reshaped not just religion, but the very landscape of Rome. Because the earliest Christian spaces were not built, they were remembered. They were borrowed from the past. They were sewn into the fabric of Roman spirituality like threads in an old tapestry. And in that tapestry, still whispered by the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Christian theologians began to reinterpret Sibylline prophecies as foretelling the coming of Christ. The most famous of these reimaginings appeared in the Sibylline Oracles, a collection of texts compiled and edited by early Christian authors who grafted their own verses into older pagan prophetic traditions. In these oracles, the Sibyls speak not of Jupiter or Apollo, but of a coming Savior, of a virgin birth, of a kingdom not of this world, to the modern mind. This may seem like borrowing, appropriation, even forgery, but in the spiritual logic of late antiquity, it was something different. Fulfillment to Christians of the 4th century. The pagan world wasn't just wrong, it was incomplete. Its temples, its myths, its rituals all were shadows of the truth to come. And so, instead of erasing the symbols, the church reinterpreted them. In fact, some of the earliest Christian art in Rome catacomb paintings, mosaics, manuscript illuminations, picts, sibyls, alongside prophets, even apostles. They were honored as pre-Christian witnesses to divine truth. This fusion is visible still. Today, the very heart of the Vatican, look up into the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, painted by Michelangelo in the 16th century, and what do you see? Not just Old Testament prophets, but sibyls. The Libyan sibyl, reaching with muscular arms to turn the pages of her scroll. The Delphic sibyl, caught mid-sentence, eyes distant with vision. The Cumaean sibyl, aged and hunched, yet radiant with knowledge. They're there in the most sacred chapel in Catholicism. They survived. They were not crushed under the weight of the saints. They were reimagined into the story. But beneath that reimagination lay a different kind of displacement, because while the Christian world honored the sibyls in art and text, it displaced their terrain, where they once spoke through mystery and symbol. Saints now reigned through doctrine and structure. The church replaced prophecy with authority. It replaced vision with institution in Vatican Hill, the threshold between life and death. Vision and silence became the center. This transformation, what had once been a place for whispers and ambiguous rites, became the seat of Peter. The See of Rome, the home of the Pope, a hill of uncertainty, became a hill of absolute truth. But did it ever lose its old voice entirely? That's the question, because the necropolis remained below. The mosaics of peacocks and vines, the painted walls bearing names of the dead, the corners where, perhaps, someone once poured a libation, not for salvation, but for sight. And when archaeologists dug into the hill again in the 20th century, they weren't just looking for Peter. They were retracing the quiet transformation of sacred space. They were mapping a story that had been layered, not deleted. A ghost story, but not of spirits, of memory in one of the underground chambers Mausoleum S. Discovered under the southern wall of the Basilica, there is a faded fresco that shows a woman in flowing robes, her hand outstretched, her face turned not toward the viewer, but toward something unseen. Her name is lost. She may have been a mourner, or a wife, or a symbolic figure, but some scholars argue she represents a sibyl, a trace of the old voice left on the wall, buried under a saint. And maybe that's what Vatican Hill really is. Not a triumph of one faith over another, but a conversation going, uneven, buried, and resurfaced. The sibyls once spoke here. Then Peter was buried here. Then saints were built here. And now we walk atop all of them, each step tracing not a single path to truth, but a sediment of belief, longing, prophecy, and silence. Silence. The world that Constantine inherited was not yet Christian. It was many things all at once, traditional and changing, cute and skeptical, full of temples that stood tall but were increasingly hollow inside. The old gods remained in stone and story, but they no longer stirred fear. Their power had become ceremonial, decorative, and into that growing silence came a new voice, but not a loud one. Not yet Christianity. By the early 4th century, was still a religion of whispers. It had survived by knowing how to move carefully through catacombs, across borders, under the gaze of magistrates who might tolerate or persecute depending on the mood of the emperor. And so, when it was finally legalized in 313 AD under Constantine's Edict of Milan, it emerged, blinking into the light like something both ancient and new. The church did not rush to destroy the past. Instead, did something subtler. It translated. And nowhere is this act of translation more visible or more forgotten than on Vatican Hill. This hill, which had been a cemetery for pagans, a place of marginal rites and whispered visions, was about to become the holiest site in the Christian world, but not through conquest, through adaptation, through the slow layering of meaning. The Sibyls, those ancient prophetesses of Rome and the wider Mediterranean, were part of this process. They had long served as liminal figures in Roman culture, occupying a strange space between religious authority and outsider status. They were feared but needed, sought out but never fully embraced. Some were consulted by emperors, others were left to rot in the peripheries of written history. And yet, despite their murky origins and contradictory voices, the Sibyls survived. Why? Because they offered something the Roman world could never quite replace: the illusion of direct access to divine truth. They didn't require temples. They didn't need priests. They spoke, in that voice frightening, riddled with symbols, always half-understanding guard long after the gods they served faded into marble dust. When Christian thinkers began to emerge, scholars and power brokers in the 4th and 5th centuries, they recognized the value of that voice. They didn't silence it, they reinterpreted it. The most famous example comes from a strange and powerful legend, the tale of the Sibylline books. According to Roman tradition, the original Sibylline books were a collection of prophecies offered by a Sibyl to King Tarquin the Proud, the last king of Rome. She offered him 9 books at a high price. He refused. She burned 3 and offered 6. He refused again. She burned 3 more. Finally, he paid her full price for the last 3. Those books, filled with riddling prophecy, were stored in the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill and consulted in times of great crisis, fires, plagues, wars. The books were treated as sacred, though few knew what they actually said. Centuries later, these books were lost, but the legend remained. Christian apologists saw an opportunity. If the Sibyls had once spoken truth to Roman kings, might they have, without knowing it, foretold the coming of Christ? Thus began the long project of reinterpreting pagan prophecy. Christian authors compiled texts known as the Sibylline Oracles, a mix of older Greek and Latin verse attributed to various Sibyls, interwoven with Christian themes. These oracles did not openly contradict the old Sibylline style. They used it, reframed it. They portrayed the Sibyls as proto-Christians, delivering cryptic messages about a virgin birth, a righteous king, and the fall of a corrupt empire. They spoke of the cross not as a Roman execution device, but as a sign written in the heavens to the faithful of the late empire. This was not fraud. It was fulfillment. Christianity was not rejecting the past. It was claiming to be what the past had always been pointing toward. And so the Sibyls entered the church not as saints, not quite, but as witnesses. Their names, Delphic, Cumean, Erythraean, Tiburtine, began to appear alongside the names of Hebrew prophets in the writings of Jerome, Augustine, Ken, Lactantius. Art followed. By the time of the Renaissance, the Sibyls were enshrined not just in text, but in paint and stone. Michelangelo gave them body-strong, weathered, visionary in the Sistine Chapel. Each Sibyl is paired with a prophet. The old voices beside the new covenant, the pre-Christian beside the preordained. But this sanctification of the Sibyls in art concealed a deeper transformation happening beneath their feet. On the very hill that would come to represent the new spiritual heart of Europe, Vatican Hill. As Constantine's architects filled the ancient slope with earth and broken tombs, they laid the foundations for St. Peter's Basilica. They were not simply building a church. They were asserting a theology. This site, once peripheral, once a graveyard, home to obscure rituals and half-remembered voices, was being made central. Peter's tomb became the anchor. But Peter was not alone. Buried alongside him were hundreds, perhaps thousands of other Romans, pagans, Christians, freedmen, slaves, women whose names appear in faded Latin on plaster walls, children interred with toys and tiny sandals, and somewhere, buried even deeper, were traces of rites we no longer understand. Libations poured in the dark, prayers muttered at twilight, fragments of broken tureens tucked into corners. These were not acts of faith in the Christian sense, but they were acts of belief, of longing, of needing something beyond the visible world, and that need, the need to be heard, to be answered, to be remembered, was the thread that the church quietly seized. It did not need to destroy the Bible. It needed only to speak louder, with structure, with scripture, with permanence. Where the Sibyls spoke once and were gone, the church built walls, domes, basilicas. Where the Sibyls whispered, the church preached. Where the Sibyls lived at the margins, the church made itself the center. But beneath all this, the paint, the stone, the doctrine, the hill, remembered excavations in the 20th century revealed symbols that blurred the line between prophecy and doctrine in one tomb decorated around the year 280. A mosaic depicts a seated woman holding a scroll with a strange inscription she knew before it was written. Scholars debate its meaning. Some suggest it refers to a Christian prophetess. Others whisper it might be a nod to a Sibyl. The wall doesn't say. It doesn't need to, because by then, the two voices had already begun to merge. And so, Vatican Hill became not just a place where saints replaced Sibyls, but where their voices became indistinguishable. One overtook the other, but not entirely. Even today, in the quiet parts of the necropolis, you can see their traces in the eyes of a painted figure whose identity has been lost, in the faded edge of a scroll once held in a fresco, now worn away, in the strange silence that surrounds a grave. No one has claimed these are not ghosts. They are echoes, and they remind us of something quietly radical, that the history of belief is not a clean line. It is a layering. The Sibyls did not become saints. They were not canonized, but they were remembered, not as threats, not as heretics, as forerunners, bridges, whispers that pointed toward something larger than themselves. And in this way, perhaps, the Christian transformation of Vatican Hill was not a conquest, but a conversation, one that continues even now in silence. In silence, Vatican Hill, once a burial slope on the margins of Rome, now gleams with grandeur. But beneath the gold leaf and polished marble, beneath the symphonic echoes of choral masses and camera clicks, lies the slow weight of silence. Not just the hush of reverence, but a deeper quiet, the kind that settles in when stories are left untold, when meanings are restructured, and when sacredness is moved from mouth to monument. To understand the full transformation of this hill from a zone of strange, half-remembered prophecy to the seat of spiritual empire, we must return to the foundations, not the theological ones, but the physical, because nothing in the Vatican stands alone. Everything rests upon something older. The pilgrims who cross St. Peter's Square today may never realize that they are walking on a hill once outside the city's sacred boundary, that the obelisk rising from the square's center once stood at the heart of Nero's Circusa, place of death, not devotion. That beneath the great dome of Michelangelo, beneath the baldacchino of Bernini, beneath the altar, gilded and glowing there, is soil once walked by women who murmured visions and men who buried their dead in silence. This layered geography is not accidental. It is the product of centuries of spiritual engineering, slow overriding of meaning. But in that process, when saints replaced Sibyls, because rose atop bone and dust, something remained. something not quite absorbed. The Sibyls, their names still hover in the art, their scrolls still visible in stone and paint, their words echoed in liturgical poetry. But what they were, their role as independent voices of divinity, was replaced, not by force, but by structure. Where the Sibyl once stood alone, speaking in riddles to whoever dared to ask, the saint became part of an order, a litany, a calendar. Their stories were collected, edited, retold. The Sibyls spoke from caves. The saints spoke from cathedrals. It was not simply a change of content. It was a change in control. By the 5th century, Christian church had become an institution capable of defining sacred space, sacred voice, and sacred narrative. The fluidity of earlier traditions, the space for ambiguity, for personal revelation, for multiple meanings, was narrowed in the old world. Prophecy had been a performance. The Sibyl did not need to explain herself. Her value was in her mystery. Her words were meant to trouble as much as to clarify. They were invitations into the unknown. In the New World, prophecy became doctrine. The words were standardized, the voices regulated. Vision was replaced by verification. And in this, Vatican Hill became both symbol and symptom, because this hill had once been precisely the kind of place where boundaries blurred, where memory and ritual were inseparable, where burial and belief intertwined. The earliest Christians understood this. That's why they gathered at tombs, not to escape Rome's sacred geography, but to reshape it, to turn the places of death into wells of meaning, to stand where others feared to stand, with silence or song, that this too was holy ground. But as time passed, as Constantine's Basilica became a magnet for power, as Peter's tomb was enshrined in gold and wrapped in theological authority, the hill's original ambiguity was stripped away. It became clean, sanitized, singular. In this process, though it brought beauty and grandeur, also flattened the strange, spiritual landscape that had made the place so powerful in the first place. Consider this: when the Basilica was built in the 4th century, the workers laid fill over an entire section of the necropolis. They preserved the structure unintentionally by sealing it. The rooms were left intact, their walls and frescoes untouched by weather or light for over 1,600 years. And yet, they were forgotten. No pilgrim lit a candle in those tombs. No priest offered mass for those names. They were buried, not by earth, but by narrative, because the new sacred story required clarity. Apostles, not oracles; martyrs, not mystics; the voice of the church, not the voice of the wind. And so the hill grew quiet until 1939. That year, its work began on Pope Pius XI's burial chamber beneath St. Peter's. The workers accidentally pierced a wall. Behind it, they found space, a den, another wall, then a corridor. They had rediscovered the necropolis, and when they entered it, the world tilted, because here, in this forgotten city of the dead, was proof of a Rome that had never been fully erased. Rooms painted with vines and stars, inscriptions in Greek and Latin, names no longer spoken, but etched in defiance of silence. Aebutus, Flavia, Scapula, and in one chamber, a figure painted on plaster arms, outstretched, mouth open, not preaching, just a speaking. Some believe it was a Christian symbol. Others believe it was older, a Sibyl. No way to prove it, but the feeling lingers, that under all the layers beneath the saints, beneath the bishops, beneath the pilgrims, there was a voice that never quite stopped. A voice that knew how to remain. The Vatican did not suppress this discovery. In fact, over the decades that followed, the site was carefully excavated and protected. Today, it's known as the Scavi, the Vatican necropolis, and a limited number of visitors are allowed each day. But there are rules. You must walk quietly. You may not, photograph. you may not touch. You descend beneath the floor of the basilica, through dark corridors, past tombs with names still legible, past urns still resting on ledges, until you reach the center of the shrine of Peter. There, the guide will point to a small space behind the wall, a cavity. The bones, they will tell you, softly, that these may be Peter's. They may also tell you that nearby, just a few feet away, are other tombs, unmarked, unvenerated. One belongs to a woman named Papilia, another to a freed slave named Marcus Victor. Both were buried before Christianity's rise, and both, now, share space with the saint, not by design, by geography, by sediment, and perhaps by fate. Because the hill remembers, it remembers the Sibyls, whose voices once slipped through the cracks in order and logic. It remembers the first Christians, who dared to claim that a grave could be a gateway. It remembers the builders who poured stone upon stone, not realizing they were preserving the past they sought to replace. And it remembers those who came, later centuries later, digging not for treasure, but for truth. So what then is the truth of Vatican Hill? Is it Peter's tomb? Is it the Basilica? Is it the dome, the saints, the marble, the doctrine? Or is it the silence underneath? The silence that speaks, not in thunder or prophecy, a decree and decreed. A woman's name on a brick, a woman's name on a brick, a painted eye staring out from plaster, a corridor that goes just a little deeper than anyone expected. In the end, perhaps the transformation of this sacred hill was never truly about replacing Sibyls with saints. Perhaps it was about layering one voice over another. And if we listen closely, not with our ears, but with our memory, we might still hear them. The saints chanting out the Sibyls, whispering, the pilgrims praying, and beneath them all, the stones waiting not to be worshipped, just to be remembered. The Vatican necropolis had slept for more than 1,500 years, sealed beneath the foundations of St. Peter's Basilica, forgotten by maps, bypassed by renovations, and hidden behind brick walls and layers of ceremony. The ancient tombs had been undisturbed since the days of Constantine. We were not empty. They were filled with names, bones, stories, and silence. That silence remained unbroken until the year 1939, when Pope Pius XI died and requested to be buried as close as possible to the bones of St. Peter. His wish was not unusual. Many popes had been buried in the grottos beneath the basilica over the centuries, but this time something different happened. As the workers prepared the burial site, they began digging into an area long assumed to be solid foundation. They expected brick and fill, perhaps a few minor architectural features. What they found was a cavity, then another dot, then the remnants of walls. Old, but intact. They had broken into something much older than the Renaissance. They had broken into memory at first. It wasn't clear what had been found. The Vatican's architectural archives were extensive, but none of the blueprints referenced this section of the hill. Space didn't align with known chapels or crypts. The air was still. The walls were painted, and there were inscriptions. Latin, Greek names no longer listed in any church registry. It quickly became clear that this was not part of the basilica's original floor plan. This was older, much older. It was the ancient necropolis of Vatican Hill. The Vatican, cautious by nature, did not immediately publicize the discovery. The world was teetering on the edge of war. Europe in 1939 was a continent holding its breath. But behind the Vatican walls, quiet revolution was beginning an archaeological project unlike any the church had ever undertaken. Pope Pius XII, who had succeeded Pius XI in March 1939, authorized a secret excavation. The aim was not just to explore the necropolis, but to find one thing in particular, the true burial place of St. Peter. For centuries, tradition had held that the high altar of St. Peter's Basilica stood directly above the bones of the apostle, but documentation was limited. The Constantinian Basilica had preserved the memory of Peter's tomb, but its exact location had been obscured by centuries of construction, demolition, and rebuilding down. With this unexpected entrance into the past, there was a chance to see what had been buried literally and figuratively. The team assembled for the project included priests, historians, architects, and archaeologists. Chief among them was Monsignor Ludwig Cass, a German priest and former politician with a keen interest in history. Alongside him were lay scholars such as Professor Enrico Josi and Antonio Ferrua, a Jesuit archaeologist whose meticulous eye would become crucial. The excavations were difficult. They had to be carried out in secret, often by lamplight, in tight spaces beneath tons of sacred architecture. The risk of structural collapse was real. The political implications, should they find something controversial, were even more daunting. But the deeper they dug, the clearer it became. They had uncovered a lost world, stretching beneath the basilica. Directly below the modern-day grottos lay a narrow necropolis street flanked by mausoleums. Some tombs were simple. Others were decorated with frescoes, mosaics, and inscriptions still visible after 17 centuries. The walls bore names, some pagan, some Christian, some ambiguous. The dead, long silent, had voices again. One mausoleum, built around 160 AD, belonged to the Valeri family. The frescoes inside were richly colored reds, greens, and yellows, forming geometric patterns and pastoral scenes. A painted dove perched on a branch. A shepherd stood among sheep. The tomb contained marble sarcophagi with Latin inscriptions, dedications from husbands to wives, parents to children. Other tombs were more austere. Plain brick walls, simple stone slabs. A few bore Christian symbols, anchors, fish, the Chiro. Most were pagan, but even in their silence, they spoke. They spoke of a Rome that had lived, loved, and died on this hill long before the basilica rose. As the excavation progressed, the team worked their way toward what was believed to be the focal point to shrine above Peter's supposed grave. This area, known as the Edicula or Trapian, was a small marble monument believed to have been erected in the 2nd century by Pope Anicetus, or another early bishop. Behind this structure lay a red-painted wall known as the graffiti wall, which bore a dense collection of scratched inscriptions from early pilgrims. Some were barely legible, others were clear. Petros Eni, Peter is here. These words, carved by anonymous hands sometime in the 3rd or 4th century, became the heart of the excavation's mystery. Were they literal? Symbolic? Was this truly Peter's final resting place? Behind the graffiti wall, in a small niche, the excavators found a collection of bones wrapped in purple cloth, embroidered with gold thread. They were fragmented, mixed, carefully moved. Analysis revealed they belonged to a robust man in his 60s, buried sometime in the 1st century. The feet were missing a detail that, to some, lined with the tradition that Peter had been crucified upside down. A method that would have required the severing of the feet to remove the body. Were these Peter's bones? The Vatican, after extensive study and internal deliberation, declared in 1968 that they were. But even apart from that conclusion, the real significance of the excavation was broader. It confirmed what had long been whispered and assumed, that beneath the grandeur of St. Peter's lay the ordinary, dead Romans. Pagans. Christians. Merchants. Teachers. Children. People whose names had not been read in over a millennium. People buried with the hope that their names would remain, and for a long time they hadn't. They had been forgotten, sealed beneath centuries of devotion to someone else's memory. But now, on earth, their presence raised questions the church had not asked in centuries. How do we hold space for the forgotten within the structures of remembrance. How do we venerate a saint while acknowledging the thousands whose graves we built over? The Vatican was cautious in its answers. The narrative remained focused on Peter, on validation, on continuity. But scholars, quietly, began to write about something deeper, the accidental preservation of pagan Rome by the Christian world, not through mercy, through burial, by sealing the necropolis to build the Basilica. Constantine's engineers had unwittingly created a time capsule, a gallery of names and rituals untouched by the chaos of the medieval centuries. And now, in the 20th century, those rituals returned, not in practice, but in presence, in the way visitors now walk through the buzzy, with lowered voices in the way. Archaeologists copy each inscription by hand, knowing no one has read it in 1500 years. In the way, even now, a painted eye gazes out from the wall of a mausoleum, once buried, twice, and now seen again. The excavation of the necropolis did not destroy the Vatican's sanctity. It deepened it. It reminded the church and the world that sacredness does not erase the past. It builds on it. That saints do not cancel the dead they were buried beside. And that remembering is an act of faith. In the decades since the discovery, the Vatican has preserved the necropolis as a living museum. Only 250 visitors are allowed in each day. The air is carefully regulated. The light is kept low. The tombs are not cleaned too vigorously so that time can remain on the walls. And though Peter is still the center, the others are no longer invisible. They are seen, their names spoken by guides, their bones respected, their symbols reinterpreted, not as errors, but as echoes, because when you dig deep enough, not just into the ground, but into the history of belief, you find that faith is not a straight road. It is a winding street, flanked by tombs, and every name carved into stone is a question, waiting for the daylight, for the daylight. They did not expect to be remembered. Not in this way, not by soft-footed tourists whispering in guided lines, not beneath the altar of one of the most visited churches in the world, and certainly not by teams of archaeologists in white gloves, bent over ancient inscriptions with flashlights and cotton swabs. They were ordinary people when they died, some free, some enslaved, some born Roman, some immigrants to the capital from Syria, Gaul, Africa, or Judea. They were not martyrs or prophets or emperors. They did not die for a cause. They died as people do of illness, injury, childbirth, accident, age, and when they were buried in the necropolis on Vatican Hill, it was not in anonymity. Their families left names, painted inscriptions, epitaphs, marble plaques, carefully constructed mausolea. They were loved. They were remembered. But the world moved on, and memory, without tending, fades by the time Constantine's builders leveled the slope to construct the first St. Peter's Basilica in the 4th century. Most of those names had already been forgotten. Some tombs had cracked. Others had partially collapsed. Some were abandoned. The builders did not destroy all of them. They buried them, poured fill over the graves, built walls around them, trapped centuries of dust, bone, and silence under new stone. It was not malice, it was purpose. Peter's tomb was to become the anchor of a new spiritual geography. A basilica like none before it would rise from this soil. The past had to be stabilized geologically, theologically, but the names remained unspoken, waiting. It was only in the 20th century they returned to daylight. Let us walk again through the Scavide, the Vatican necropolis. Imagine yourself descending from the well-lit grandeur of St. Peter's Basilica into narrower, older spaces. The air changes, the light dims. The scent is that of stone and preservation. You enter through a modern doorway, but what lies beyond is untouched by modernity. The floor beneath your feet tilts slightly downhill, a tate, because the ancient necropolis followed the natural slope of Vatican Hill. The central path of Decumanus was once open to the sky. lined on either side with M-A-U-S-O-E-A. They are still there. Mausoleum M, Mausoleum T, Mausoleum S, each labeled by the excavation team in sequence, each belonging to families who believed their names would outlast the empire. In Mausoleum F, the Valeri family painted birds and vines on the walls. One panel shows a Panquetta, husband and wife, reclining in the Roman style, holding goblets. There is no direct reference to gods, only life, eternalized in gesture. In Mausoleum U, a freed woman named Claudia Prima was interred with her daughter. The inscription reads, "To Claudia, beloved, who sang at dusk, singer, not in the forum, not in a temple, its voice in the home, it's now preserved forever on stone." And in Mausoleum A, the mosaic floor still bears the image of a peacock with tail feathers, spread, a symbol of immortality in Roman iconography, later adopted by Christianity. Even before belief systems changed, people longed for continuity, for beauty that did not die. As you move deeper, the tombs grow humbler. Some are no more than brick walls with simple arched entrances, their inscriptions in red paint rather than marble. K. Others were clearly altered, reused, modified, expanded as families changed, as money grew or shrank, as generations passed. In one, a child was buried in a terracotta urn, likely cremated in a domestic ceremony and brought to rest. Here, around the urn were 3 tiny oil lamps, each barely large enough to hold an hour's light. The dead did not ask to be remembered like this. They asked to be remembered then, regularly, by family, by name. But now, as Vatican scholars examine each tomb, each urn, each inscription, a strange form of memory is unfolding. Not personal, not familial, but archaeological. Each name becomes a point of reference. Each tomb, a puzzle piece in the larger reconstruction of forgotten Rome. In this way, the necropolis has become not just a burial site, but a document, one that was never meant to be read. Like this. Take, for instance, the tomb of Lucius Julius Faustus. His name appears in a cramped corner of a mausoleum wall, half covered by an overlay of Christian plaster from centuries later. He was a mosaic layer by trade. His epitaph reads, "He laid the stones others walk upon. May he rest among the stars." Oh, poignant that his grave now lies beneath the stones walked upon by popes, pilgrims. Faustus has been beneath the feet of millions, unnoticed until now. The Vatican's archaeological team has made a quiet commitment not to relocate the bones, not to separate the pagan from the Christian, but to let them remain together, interred. Still, they understand something few are willing to say aloud, that the church's foundation is, literally and figuratively, layered. Peter's tomb may be the center, but it is not alone, nor was it ever. Even the shrine over his grave, the so-called Trapezium, was constructed within the context of the surrounding necropolis. The builders did not move the other tombs away, they worked around them. Peter's sanctity was made possible by the geography of ordinary death. And perhaps that is the hidden theology of this hill, that greatness, key, even holiness, emerges not from isolation, but from immersion in the human condition. Burial, loss, naming, forgetting, rediscovering. The Vatican has chosen to preserve the necropolis as it was. The bones have not been rearranged. The tombs have not been emptied, even as the identity of Peter's remains has been affirmed. The others remain unnamed but honored. In 1953, following over a decade of careful excavation and scholarship, Pope Pius XII publicly acknowledged the discovery, calling it the tomb of the Prince of the Apostles. He did not mention the other tombs by name. But since then, the Vatican has quietly allowed in to even funded research that brings its names back into daylight. This is more than preservation. It is repentance, not for a crime, for a silence, one that lasted over 1,000 years. Now, Vatican museums quietly feature replicas of the mosaic floors found in the necropolis. Academic journals publish papers on the funerary practices of Roman freedmen. Visitors to the Scavi tours are told, gently, that Peter was buried not in isolation, but among the people. And those people had names: Flavia, Aureliana, Gaius, Junius, Talia. Fortunata dot scapula dot dativa dot popilla dot children dot teachers, mothers, friends, some of them might have hated Peter's ideas, others may have never heard them, and yet now, in death, they share a hill, a slope, a foundation, not through theology, through geography. Their bones rest together beneath the Basilica, down beneath the feet of pilgrims, bishops, and popes, a hill of saints and sibyls, of apostles and artisans, of remembered and forgotten. And perhaps, when we descend into the necropolis today, we are not just visiting the past. We are witnessing what happens when memory is interrupted, but not erased, when a society builds over its dead, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity, ambition, belief, and when, centuries later, the ground opens again, the names rise through the dust like slow, silent prayers, not for resurrection, not for redemption, but for recognition. It is an odd thing to remember someone you've never met, adder still to feel the weight of their presence in a place that forgot them for centuries. But that is what happens beneath the Vatican, beneath the pageantry, beneath the theology, beneath the marble and domes and liturgies. There is a slope of earth that remembers more than we do. It remembers a time before the cross, before incense sweetened the air and choirs filled the nave, before St. Peter's name was written in gold. It remembers Rome, not as empire, but as home, a city where bakers and butchers and widows and freedmen died as all humans do, and were laid to rest by those who loved them. The final section of this story is not one of conclusion, it is one of continuation, because the excavation of the necropolis beneath St. Peter's did not just recover stone and bone. It disturbed something more fundamental. It unsettled the idea that we ever really buried the past. Let's return once more to that narrow necropolis road, the decumanus, just a few meters beneath one of the most sacred floors in Catholicism. At one end of the path lies a tomb whose walls are covered not in frescoes, but in graffiti, names, prayers, symbols, pilgrims. Centuries ago, scratched these into the plaster with iron tools, charcoal, or whatever they had. Some drew fish, the earliest symbol of Christ. Others scrawled, "Please, Peter, remember me. Pray for my son. Lord, heal my wife." And beside those messages, layered and faint, are older words, names in Latin that do not speak of Christian hope, but of Roman legacy. Gaius. Lucilla.aurelius. They are not asking to be remembered. They are stating, simply, that they were here, that they were someone, that this was their ground, even in death. And the truth is, they never left when the church rose above them. It did so unknowingly at first, later with certainty, but never with total clarity. The builders of Constantine's Basilica may have known they were disturbing an necropolis, but they did not know the names. They did not know the stories. They leveled the land, filled in the tombs, preserved some, destroyed others. It wasn't malice, it was ambition and belief. They were building a future, one that would forget, and then hundreds of years later, curiosity turned to reverence, and reverence turned to excavation, and the names came back, not just Peter, not just the apostles, but the rest, the forgotten majority. Let us linger with them now. At the close of this story, Here is a child's tomb, set back from the path. The marble slab is cracked, the inscription worn, but enough remains to read the name. Aaliyah Maxima, age 7, buried with her doll.